Hello, everyone. Welcome to 2024 Prospects for U.S. Ties with China, a special The Way Forward webinar brought to you by U.S. Heartland China Association. My name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Heartland China Association, a 501c3 nonprofit focused on promoting people-to-people exchanges and exchanging of culture, education, and business between the Heartland community and China. And we believe that not all bridges are built on concrete and steel. Equally important bridges are built on friendship, cultural communion, and commercial cooperation. Where these bridges exist, community flourish. And for this session today, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A. We did receive a lot of pre-submitted questions. We'll do our best to answer your questions. And at the end, there will be an exit survey. We welcome your feedback. Now I would like to introduce the moderator for the discussion today, and Susan Thornton. Susan spent over 3 decades in the State Department as a diplomat. Before he retired in 2018, he was acting under Deputy Secretary for East Asia Affairs. I believe I got roughly right. And so Susan is expert China, North Korea, Russia, many other topics, one of the leading experts on China today. And Susan is also teaching at Yale and also in many organizations that's engaging with U.S. foreign policy. And she's also our vice chair. So Susan, without further ado, we'll turn to you, have you lead us through the session.
Well, thank you so much, Min, and it's fantastic to be with everybody here today. Of course, what we want to mainly talk about today is the prospects for the future of U.S.-China relations, but we're also here to sort of remember and talk about the significance of both high-level diplomacy, which we saw between the U.S. and China last November in San Francisco, but also citizen diplomacy, which U.S. Heartland China Association is very much engaged in. And we have some terrific panelists with us here today. Of course, we have Min, who you've already met. She is the director of the U.S. Heartland China Association and has a long background in working in business before she came to us. We also have, of course, Governor Bob Holden, former governor of the great state of Missouri between 2001 and 2005. Governor Holden is the chairman of our board at the U.S. Heartland China Association, and he has been in public service his entire life as an official in Missouri, and then, of course, as governor. He also has chaired the Midwest Governors Association and has done a lot of citizen diplomacy and local government diplomacy with many countries around the world, including with China. We also have with us Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, who is a former U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia. He is a fellow former diplomat in following the same sort of career path that I did. He has, since retiring from the Foreign Service, been the president of the World Food Prize Foundation, and he has been also a very important advisor to our U.S. Heartland China Association. He speaks fluent Vietnamese, and he has worked in all kinds of different capacities in his State Department career. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn to our program for today and talk a little bit about what is behind the meeting that happened in San Francisco, which we're going to talk about, and a little bit about the background of U.S.-China diplomacy. Of course, the U.S. and China are very different countries. They're two major powers. They're the two biggest economies in the world, and their relationship has really seen a lot of ups and downs over the years. The leader-level diplomacy in U.S.-China relations has always been extremely important, starting from the time when Richard Nixon went to China and opened the door, so to speak. Before that, the U.S.-China relationship was really one of estrangement. We really weren't talking to each other at all. Since 1971, things have gone up and down, but basically, we saw a fairly constructive relationship between the US and China for the first decade of this century. China got into the World Trade Organization. There was a lot of economic interchange with China, of course, and the story of China's economic growth and modernization is one that's been widely remarked on as being sort of one of the great historic changes in our lifetimes in terms of bringing people out of poverty and sowing greater prosperity around the Asia-Pacific region. But of course, we've seen tensions between the US and China flare recently during the COVID pandemic. And sort of since then, there have been a lot of controversies in US-China relations. But last year, we did see this major effort by the Biden administration to try to reopen official diplomatic communications at the high level and to stabilize the relationship, which had gotten quite tense and was worrisome, not just to Americans and Chinese, but to many of our allies and partners around the world. So we saw cabinet level visits in both directions. The Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Commerce from the United States all went to Beijing in the second half of last year. Agriculture Minister Tang came to Washington to meet with Secretary Vilsack to talk about agriculture issues in Washington. We saw Foreign Minister Wang Yi come to prepare Xi Jinping's visit to San Francisco. And then, of course, we had that visit in November. And we can talk more about the history and background of U.S.-China diplomacy if we want to in the question and answer session. But I think it's important to recognize sort of what was accomplished by high-level diplomacy in November, and then we can talk about the what can be accomplished in the citizen diplomacy, which is what so many of you have been interested in. Coming out of that Xi-Biden meeting in November, we saw some criticism that engagement with China is not productive, but we did see a number of very important accomplishments. First of all, there was the work that's being done on stemming precursor chemicals that are made into fentanyl and come across the US borders and kill a lot of Americans in opiate overdoses. We've seen a lot of work stepped up between the US and China as a result of that meeting in November to try to get that more under control. And I think both sides would say that that work has been very productive. I think there's been at least 3 meetings of the working group to try to get that problem under some kind of better control. We saw the announcement of military-to-military dialogues, which had not been taking place and which led to sort of a feeling of tensions and destabilization in the relationship. Now those have been restarted. We've had some arms control consultations with China. There was a lengthy statement, joint statement on climate change cooperation that came between our climate negotiator, John Kerry, and the Chinese counterpart right before President Biden and President Xi's meeting, which was very helpful for moving an agenda forward at the Conference of the Parties that happened on climate change in Qatar soon after that. And they also, the two sides announced a dialogue on the dangers and how to curb those dangers of artificial intelligence going forward. And they're working on trying to put that together now. I think that's very important since the US and China are the 2 leaders in artificial intelligence. But I think perhaps most important for us and for sort of the sense of stabilizing the relationship and trying to reduce tensions was the conversations that the 2 leaders were able to have about the Taiwan situation across the Taiwan Strait and the tensions there. This issue has long been the most dangerous flashpoint between the US and China. There was, an election in Taiwan recently that the authorities in China were very concerned about. And I think the meeting between President Biden and President Xi was very important. The timing was important in order to outline expectations around the situation in Taiwan and to sort of telegraph some assurances one to the other such that the election would be handled in a fairly regular and routine way and not cause a crisis. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw happen. In January 18th, there was the election in Taiwan. The ruling party in Taiwan, sitting vice president, was elected with a minority of the vote, but still he had a plurality. And the responses by all three sides was quite moderate, I would say. And that is in large part, I think, due to the diplomacy that was preceding that event. So this shows you how important the leader level diplomacy can be. But we also have very important citizen diplomacy that happens between the US and China. And the US Heartland China Association has played a vital role here. As Min mentioned, we're a bridge between the American heartland and China, and we serve the interests of the heartland's, farmers and businesses and people in connecting with China. And so I'd like to turn now to our three panelists who are all there in San Francisco for the meeting between President Xi and President Biden, and who participated in the friends grouping that was assembled on the margins of that meeting to promote citizen diplomacy, to promote business-to-business ties, and have them talk about their impressions and also what can be accomplished through such meetings. So let me turn first to you, Ambassador Quinn. I'd love to hear from you sort of what were your impressions from the visit. I think you were there with the group of attendees from Iowa, and of course, Ambassador Quinn is a proud Iowan. But many of the people that were there had engaged with Xi Jinping on his first visit to the U.S. in 1985. So I'd be really curious to hear your impressions and how you think the Chinese leaders see the importance of his Iowa experience and these kind of citizen connections.
Okay, well, thank you, Susan, for that terrific overview and assessment of what happened and at the leaders' meeting that afternoon. And imagine that evening then, President Xi comes to a hotel in downtown San Francisco and to this event, which was billed as a big dinner hosted by U.S. China business organizations, which they reportedly, you had to pay a lot of money to be there. And that was preceded, though, by a small reception for about 30 people. I think we have a photo of it, which we could put up, who met with President Xi and had a chance to greet him personally. And there you see Governor Holden and I are in the front row, and next to President Xi on his left is Sarah Landy from Muscatine, and next to her is Governor Terry Branstad, the former governor of Iowa. On President Xi's right is a lady who was a part of the Kuliang Friendship Group from Fujian province, and there's Governor Holden there. And then there are Flying Tiger pilots, also right next to Ambassador Branstad, and I'm there at the end. But our group, I think, is distinguished by two factors. Number one, probably, I don't want to speak for you, Governor Holden, but probably none of us could have afforded to pay the price that all the business leaders paid, which was, in 5 figures to be at that dinner. We were there because the Chinese side invited us and picked out who they wanted to have attend. And we were there essentially as their guests. And we got to go to the dinner and to meet with President Xi. And secondly, and the most important factor is we all represented an element of people-to-people relations. And the people-to-people factor was highlighted in President Xi's major, and in my view, very important address that evening to the American business community. And he made the point that U.S.-China relations were built upon these person-to-person, people-to-people relationships, whether they were about Iowa, the U.S. Heartland China Association. And, you know, I'm sort of a twofer. I, you know, put down that I represented Iowa, but also USHCA. So we had three individuals from the Heartland China Association there. But and this was not just a one-off event. All of the people-to-people relationships that were present at that small reception have been highlighted in the past probably 6 to 9 months in special visits to China, in special articles that would appear, for example, in the China Daily, which represents, you know, in English and lays out China's important interests. They were, President Xi himself gave personal attention to them. I was at the Kuliang Friendship Forum in the summer in China. There was then an Iowa group that went to Hebei province there to highlight that. The Flying Tigers were invited to come. And so this was a significant part of the message over, you know, the past year of China stating and outlining its policy towards the United States. A second takeaway for me from that event was that President Xi's personal experiences play a very significant role in shaping China's approach to the United States. So the Iowa experience came from 1985, when he, as a 31-year-old, obscure county level executive in Hebei province, came with a corn processing delegation and went to Muscatine, Iowa. And there he stayed in the Dvorak home. And Gary Dvorak was there in that at that meeting. And President Xi recited in his speech the street address of their house where he stayed. He said, "I still remember it. It's on Bonnie Lane in Muscatine." And also were there with Luca Barone, who was his driver and guide for that. Sarah Landy, reflecting the importance she holds for President Xi, was the very first person, as we all were lined up in a protocol order. She was the first person in that group of 30 who was introduced and greeted President Xi. She had the place of honor. And then, along with one of the Flying Tiger pilots, was there at the head table with President Xi at dinner, where Min was there translating as well. And President Xi, even in his remarks, made reference to Governor Robert Ray of Iowa, whom he never met, but who was among the very first American governors ever to go to China, not after diplomatic relations, but after the Nixon visit to China and the breakthrough in relations. President Xi, I just add as a point, President Xi also in his speech made reference to inviting 50,000 youth, American youth, to come to China over the next 5 years. And it was important in that speech that he referenced the fact that he was 15 years old when he was sent to the countryside to live in villages with farmers as a youth, and how that youth experience shaped his view towards eliminating rural poverty and getting the last 100 million people out of poverty in China. So it's and the third impression is that President Xi is a unique figure in U.S. China relations. There is not going to be any future leader who will have had the kind of dramatic impact personally that President Xi had in coming as a young man to Iowa. And I remember I was the host of two things. When I greeted him, I reminded him, I hosted his father, when the governor of Guangdong, when his father came to Iowa in 1980, right after diplomatic relations, and escorted him around Iowa. And I also was the host when he came and spoke and gave a keynote address at the U.S. China Agricultural Symposium that took place in the building you see right behind me, the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates in Des Moines. And as part of that visit, Governor Branstad held a state dinner for him at the Iowa State Capitol. And in his toast, President Xi recalled how deeply impressed and moved he was by seeing the sunrise over the Mississippi River, and quoted Mark Twain. I've never heard a foreign official speak about our country in that way ever. And so he is a unique figure. So let me stop there. Just those three kind of takeaways from that small meeting of 30 individuals before the dinner.
I think it really shows, how individual people's experience does sort of come to bear in high-level diplomacy and in international relations, right?
Yes.
Where you stand comes from where you sit, and the fact that he had those deep personal experiences with the heartland was probably, as you say, incredibly making an impression on him at that age. Governor Holden, I'd love to turn to you for your impressions about the visit, and also we've gotten a lot of audience interest in sort of the role of exchanges and citizen diplomacy, especially with China. And since you've done so much of that in your career, I'd love to hear what you think about how, these exchanges and this citizen diplomacy can make a difference.
Well, first of all, these exchanges are extremely important, not only for the immediately results, but also long term. And what struck me at the meetings that we had, and I traveled, from the heartland to California, is that we had an opportunity to open up that dialogue and really lay down with President Xi and us on how we could find ways to work together and be successful, because that's what he came from. It was his father opening doors and establishing the foundations. And so we were given the opportunity, and I had a very nice interaction with several people from China, as well as I read all of his speech on the way back to Missouri, that he wants to open that door. He wants us to figure out a way to work together to be successful and to build those bridges of success that can be a benefit both to the United States and the Heartland region, but also China and the rest of the world. And so I found it very engaging. I read his speech on the way back to Missouri. Very thoughtful, very insightful, and I think very much focused on how do we build a bridge that works for everybody going forward? How do we build that foundation to where people in our country and people in China and other people around the world can be a participant in it, be successful in it, be safe from it, and proceed to really build a better world for tomorrow?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. Let me now turn to Min. I understand that you were called on to do some impromptu interpreting for President Xi. But can you talk about how the USHCA and other heartland presence in San Francisco helps to build bridges for the future? And what can be accomplished with these non-official channels? Do you have an example, a specific example of how these channels can move the ball forward?
Yes. First of all, it was such an honor that we were invited. USHCA has such a strong representation there. It was actually a little bit surreal for me because right before San Francisco, I was sending off the Heartland mayors back home and visiting my mom in Xi'an very briefly before I flew to San Francisco to meet Governor Holden and Ambassador Quinn.
So you were in China?
Right before, yes. Actually, I was on the same flight from Beijing to San Francisco, and there were a bunch of CCTV cameras. I was like, what's going on? They said, well, this route just started like the other day. And then I realized Ambassador Byrne is queuing up for the same flight, right? He had no entourage. I was so impressed. But of course, he sat in front of the airplane. I was in the back. But the most amazing thing for us is we were invited because we are not business titans. We were as Ambassador Quinn said, we couldn't have afforded to go there. But the fact that we were invited, when I look around the room of the friends, I realize that sometimes, in US, we feel like we are the minority, still advocating for finding win-win and finding the path forward. But when you look around the room with the Flying Tiger, Iowa friends, I realize that there are other people like us who are still optimistic that we want to be part of the solution. And so that was one thing, is we feel recognized, appreciated, at least by being invited by the Chinese side. Another thing was really interesting is in the interaction in that room, as Ambassador Quinn and Governor Holden will know, it was very warm. It's so warm. Just there's a deep sense of friendship, trust. Like that's kind of in Chinese saying, if you are friends, everything 其他都好说, everything is easy, right? If you have that trust, friendship. So that interaction was very different from the other group interaction. In a way, I feel like this is a kind of message from the Chinese side, is they really place a significant value at that kind of civil society, citizen diplomacy, and to invite us there. And for us, that's music to our ear, because that's what we believe. We believe that there are important fierce engagement, political, economic, and also cultural. And so that's where we think that the citizen diplomats, like those in the Old Friends group, are really helping both sides, opening up more space. So again, as I said, we felt recognized, appreciated. I also felt like we're in a community, even though not a huge community. It was wonderful that Jan Barris, my mentor on a national committee for U.S. China relations, which I'm a member of, she tapped my shoulder, said, "Hey, I need you to be the translator for Xi Jinping." I was like, "Me?" She said, "Yes." "Where do I sit?" "Behind him." I was like, "Me?" She said, "Yes." And so I was very honored. I also felt like maybe we looked up some of the political figures, like, way up there, but they're real people in a way. So I see a lot of Xi Jinping interaction with old friends are very like old friends. He was comfortable, everyone's comfortable, but the interaction is different when he's with a different group of people. So those are some of my takeaways. I think what will help with the bridge building is one, and people see, oh, the kind of work we do is important. So maybe the private sector from both US and China will realize that this area that they need to invest more in. Because in our space, sometimes it's very hard. We don't have a lot of resources. So that's very helpful to see the work we do being appreciated. And also one thing I will mention is after I came back from that trip, I got a letter from Ambassador Burns, US ambassador to China. He was thanking me for bringing the Heartland Mayor Direction to China. I was so surprised. So again, feel that we are being appreciated by both sides, even though we're doing the very challenging people-people diplomacy on very limited resources today. So I think that was a big benefit for us, is to be recognized.
Great. No, thanks for that. It really gives you a sense of the sort of the interpersonal kind of relations and the importance. And as you said, these are just people. So the importance of friendship and trust. I'd like to dig in a little bit on that because, I mean, I know that this is very important to the Chinese side, but there are a lot of, voices now in the United States that say that, Chinese friendship is really kind of offered as a kind of a false flag, or as a kind of a, way of, inserting themselves in sort of an underhanded way into either US business or US society. And there's been a lot of sort of negative talk about kind of engagement with China. And, we've all been talking about sort of the positive things and the things that can be accomplished. But my understanding is that, the Chinese and Xi Jinping himself in the speech talked about, how important it is that we figure out and we be able to communicate whether or not the US and China are going to be partners or whether we're going to be adversaries. And so I think this idea of, whether you're a friend of China or not has really been kind of twisted around a little bit in the American narrative. And sometimes people are seen as naive if they, respond to Chinese overtures of friendship. So I'd I'd like to get your sort of take on that, and how you think, you know, we should properly understand this dynamic, and how people should respond if they're accused of being sort of tankies, or you know, being taken in by the Chinese kind of friendly overtures.
Susan, I would encourage everybody to, if they can, to get a copy of the president's speech in California, so that they can hear his words and his thought process. And I think that is very important. And I think we can build this foundation by looking at it from a win-win situation, not a win versus loss situation. And so I think the opportunity is there. The question is, are we willing to sit down and figure out how to make it work for both sides and both elements involved? And if we can do that, I think we can have a very successful future, both in our economy and also our culture.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Ambassador Quinn, go ahead.
So I was going to say, I had just come back from China just a few days earlier than Min. I had been on my second visit to China of 2023. Also, I was once interpreter for the President of the United States in Vietnamese in the White House. So I know how nervous you can get in that kind of situation. But turning to the speech. So as I sat in the dinner, having had this very nice opportunity to greet President Xi, have this small reception, and he got to that one line in his speech where he said, here is the fundamental question, you know, are we partners or adversaries? And as Governor Holden said, get hold of the speech, because in China, I believe, every word of the speech was carefully crafted, carefully considered, thought about in their foreign policy structure up to President Xi himself about what I'm going to say. And that jumped out at me as saying, he is here. He made this trip, in my view, to APEC, because there was no great overriding need that he had to be there. And I think he made this to come and as much as meet with President Biden, and that was so important, to give this speech to everybody in America, standing on American soil, and say, he didn't say it's your election year, but it is. And as we are making decisions, bear in mind, this is the fundamental question you have to decide. What is your approach to us? I think all of the programs over the past 9 to 10 months, his remarks in his speech said, we're prepared to be partners. We're prepared to be positive. We don't want to be adversaries. That's our policy in all of this. And so how this should then lead to a further, discussion in our country among us about how do we want to answer that question. Because I believe that China is worried that the US and China are on a course to be adversaries, and that will lead to some conflict, potentially to some really significant conflict. And they want the record to be clear, if that happens, that they said, we can be partners, we can be friends, and we've done all these things, including our president coming to the United States and to make that statement. And so that if things go badly, don't blame us on this. So I thought the speech deserved a lot more attention in the American press, and that it was very significant for that reason. Just to add quickly, my response to it was I wrote a piece in the Des Moines Register on January 28th saying, here's a place where we could be partners. We could address the single greatest challenge our planet will face over the next 25 years. Can we produce sustainably enough nutritious food to feed 9 to 10 billion people? And that challenge will be greatest in Africa. And I've said the US, in my article, the US and China could partner to uplift Africa, not by doing anything that has to do with biotechnology or science or intellectual property or stealing anything, but by upgrading rural roads, because roads were key to China eliminating poverty, and they were a key to the development of the American heartland. So that was my idea of saying, here's how we could be partners in a really big deal.
So if I may weigh in, yeah, it was interesting because again, I was very close to Xi when he gave the remarks, and he was speaking Chinese, which was my native language. And later, when I read the official translation, and I noticed subtle where there's always some loss in translation. So this is where, again, as a Chinese American, I call upon all the Chinese American out there to think about your language, your cultural dexterity as a special talent to help build this bridge of understanding today. Because I could hear a couple of times that his emotion was coming through. One was when he talked about when he spent 7 years in the countryside. He went off script. He wasn't looking at the paper. He was looking at the crowd. I bet he would have carried on, except got back to script. So that's one part. He really talked about how much he really cared about the people. And I know I'm a US citizen, but I was standing on the side. I can feel that genuine emotion coming through. Second part was really interesting. He talked about the terms are 天人合一,道法自然, which is really interesting because they are very quoted among the Tai Chi practitioner group like me. It's very philosophical about people and nature one, and there's a way of nature. So I'm thinking, okay, is she a Tai Chi practitioner or, but again, it's really interesting. You could talk about a very long time horizon. 158 years ago, Chinese built the railroad. 78 years ago, we met in San Francisco, World War II. So his speech, unlike Secretary Raimondo's, which is a target to the private sector, is coming with solution, your capital, innovation. She totally was like rising above that, talking about people and individuals, that we can be in the history of the river history, be those valuable pieces that remaining. So one thing that's really interesting, I think that question is almost philosophical. It's like when I tell my kids that, hey, glass half empty or half full, it's your decision, and that will change your perception. So I think if we take the 天人合一, the Taoist or the Eastern philosophy, it doesn't have to be answered. It could be both. I think the sense I got is Chinese side is ready for both. So fundamentally, they talk about, okay, let's not be a boxer beating each other. Let's outdo each other like a golf game. I fundamentally think the Chinese side is thinking we're doing Tai Chi push hands.
That's so interesting. We got a question in the chat about differences in the approach to China by different U.S. political parties, and your point about sort of a long-term time horizon sort of sets a stage for the answer that I want to give to that question, which is we're not going to have an effective policy toward China if it's going to be something that's going to change every 4 years in America. You've got to have a united sort of national consensus around what we're doing about this, what I would call most important, most consequential relationship that we have in the world. And if it's going to be switching back and forth, I just don't see how that's going to be beneficial to the American people and to American interests. So I think this question is really at the heart of it. And I haven't really heard any political sort of candidate in the US answer it very clearly. I think that probably reflects the sort of difficulty of politics in our country at the moment. But we certainly have to generate a national consensus around how to approach China. And I think probably, are we going to be partners or are we going to be adversaries, probably we're going to have to find ways to partner on a lot of things with China. I mean, in many areas, they're the biggest actor, or the two of us are the biggest actors by far in the world on things like, first of all, the economy, second of all, the military, third of all, science and technology. I mean, we have the two biggest science and technology fields, and our scientists, if you look at any scientific papers today in the world, there's usually, American and Chinese authors collaborating. So, it's very hard. I don't know if people are very aware of really how intertwined we are, how, kind of codependent we are in many, many areas, and how we're going to need to work together to solve a lot of the big challenges that the world faces. And I think the Chinese, you're right, Min, they have a different system than ours. I'm not saying it's better. I don't necessarily think it's better, but they are able to take this sort of longer term time horizon to look at things and have maybe a bit more subtle way of thinking about their moves. And I hope that we can generate, some kind of a consensus in our country that's going to get us to a place where we can have a concerted approach and that's going to benefit, America, but also, as Governor Holden said, find that sort of win-win common ground place. We've got a lot of other questions in the chat, and, a lot about sort of, problems that have been raised by lots of commentators around the world about things that China is doing. I mean, one of the things that's clear and that a lot of people mentioned as part of the background to President Xi's visit to California, Ambassador Quinn, you said he didn't need to come to California, and I think that that's right. I mean, they could have sent their premier to come to that meeting. But, one of the things people said was in the background was that the Chinese economy is facing challenges right now, and that, really what the Chinese government is seeking to do is to try to lower the temperature in its relations with many of, especially Western countries and advanced economies, to try to focus on their own domestic challenges right now. So I don't know if any of you has any comments about the Chinese economy. There's a question about whether American companies are moving out of China to other geographies. Both Min and Ambassador Quinn were in China recently. So maybe, I don't know if you have any comments about sort of how the Chinese kind of system and struggling economy bears on the prospects for U.S. China relations going forward.
Ambassador, so
Min.
I was in China quite a bit. I think that, yes, the economy is a dark cloud overshadowing a lot of things. But one thing that I was reminded is that there's a Chinese saying, 30年河东30年河西, means there's a cycle, right? Economic cycles. We had a crisis. China maybe artificially prevented crisis for a while, but now they come to some of the problems are coming, right? So I think, again, I think one of the policymaker made something really interesting, that we don't throw the rock down when someone is having a hard time, right? So China helped us last time when we had the financial crisis. So I think it's really great that our cabinet leaders, treasurer are going over, because economy-wise, we're all tight. If China is truly suffering, I think it's not good news for the world, right? It is definitely a serious problem, actually pushing Chinese government to try all kinds of new things. And some of the ironclad things like hukou was even being discussed, being disbanded in some experiment places. If
hukou is the system they have in China, where people in the countryside are registered to live in the countryside, and people who are registered in the cities can live in the cities, and you can't go back and forth, right?
There's still a lot of things like that that's kind of hindering its economic potential. So I think it's too early to say, yeah, China at the peak, honestly. I think, again, one thing, I think one of the questions, are we partner, are we adversarial, is there are a lot of questions we don't have answer. Neither side have for sure answer. So again, I think economy is a real challenge, but I truly feel like the Xi's message, again, if from American point of view, it serves China's interest, makes Xi looks good. But again, I think we simplify a lot of the rationale behind it. I think he truly enjoyed meeting his old friends. And he actually, a lot of corporate titans were very surprised to be sitting next to those people they don't even know, right? So like that kind of get American to think about why. That was interesting. Ambassador
So,
Quinn?
yeah,
Ambassador
so
Quinn, yeah. And if you could also talk about, since we have a bunch of questions about, kind of problems posed from the security side, what is the prospect for a crisis over Taiwan, or what about these cyber security concerns, et cetera? I mean, yeah.
sure. So I would say, if you were here through the Iowa caucuses, 8 or 9 months of political ads, attacking China was the #1 way to get viewed by politicians who wanted to be president to get votes in Iowa. So that does not augur well for what the official relationship would look like. On the other hand, agriculture is the #1 place with the potential for having the US and China have the most successful and positive relations. I refer to it as peace through agriculture. The 2 most significant figures in that endeavor, neither are living any longer, but are Norman Borlaug, Iowa's greatest hero, for whom the building behind me is named and whose statue stands in the US Capitol, the father of the Green Revolution, America's greatest agricultural scientist, and Yunlong Ping, the father of hybrid rice, whose image is also in that building behind me because he was a winner of the World Food Prize, the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. And the one thing, one place where Democrats and Republicans in Iowa all come together in a bipartisan way is in our building to honor Dr. Borlaug, to address agriculture. And in last October, the Chinese ambassador was in Des Moines at a ceremony to sign approximately $7 billion in US soy exports to China. That was on a Monday. On the Friday, the vice governor of Hebei province was in Des Moines at another ceremony, signing another couple of $2 billion in soy imports from the United States to Hebei. And agriculture has provided the basis since Xi Jinping first came on a corn processing delegation. Now, turning to the potential for conflict, the Iowa history of citizen diplomacy, one of the most significant stories is about Khrushchev coming to Iowa in 1959 at the way I describe it, because I commissioned a painting about it, as the single most dangerous moment of all human history. I'm old enough to remember when the missiles were poised to be launched from the US and the Soviet Union at each other during high points of high crisis. And Khrushchev came to Iowa and visited the farm of Roswell Garst and stood at the corn crib and held up an ear of corn and said to Garst, "Why can't I have corn like this in the Soviet Union?" And for the next 2 decades, Garst, his nephew named John Crystal, and others went back and forth between the US and the Soviet Union as informal ambassadors of agriculture. Now, they never negotiated and never talked about intercontinental ballistic missile reduction or anything. But what they showed was that there was room in relationships for there to be cooperation and understanding on other things. And as a result, those missiles were never fired. And so that lesson, the lesson of Japan and how 15 years after World War II, Americans helped Japan deal with the consequences of a great tsunami by providing food and agriculture assistance and by shipping 30 or 40 hogs to Japan on an Air Force plane to help restart their animal agriculture.
Okay.
That's, I think, potential.
Great. No, you point out the ties with agriculture, which are so important. China's obviously the biggest consumer and the biggest importer of food in the world. So the U.S. is a huge exporter, obviously, and that is definitely an area where we ought to be doing more. I think getting back to the question about sort of, are we partners or are we adversaries? We have a great question in the from the audience about you know, whether or not, given all of the rhetoric about the threat that China poses to the U.S., and as you said, Ambassador Quinn, you know, it was front and center during the Iowa caucuses as the most favored kind of topic to raise if you want to, you know, bashing China to get attention from voters. The question is it too late because American citizens now already view China as a threat and want to see politicians get tough on China? And I think we should also, incorporating in this question, you know, take up the issue of people to people ties. I mean, someone mentioned that President Xi's speech invited 50,000 American students to go back to China. We know that the number of American students in China dropped to almost zero during the pandemic, and we haven't really been able to recover it. We've got a lot of Chinese students in the heartland, in other places in the United States, and they contribute a lot to our campuses and our vibrant kind of communities. But there have been a lot of questions about, you know, Chinese students and Chinese scientists and Chinese researchers, et cetera. You know, do you think, Governor Holden, is it too late? Do Americans already view China as a kind of adversary, or is there hope to sort of turn the tide back to something more subtle, something more nuanced, and something that's going to be more constructive and beneficial to Americans?
No, I think it's there. As I was listening a while ago to your comments, it's never too late to do the right thing. And if we can build that bridge and identify good people in our culture, good people in the Chinese culture, and build those bridges of opportunity where they can both be economically and socially successful, then we have the potential of having real peace. You have war when people feel like they're being left out, run over, and cast aside. So I think that what we're doing and what we're talking about is laying a foundation to build that bridge of opportunity so the Chinese people can be successful, the American people can be successful, whoever works hard and gets things done can all be successful, and we can live in peace. People want to live in peace if they feel like they're secure and safe.
I mean, your comments remind me a little bit of the dynamic that occurred, and Ambassador Quinn, you mentioned Japan, but the dynamic between the United States and Japan in sort of the 1980s. If you'll remember, you know, I'm old enough to remember very vividly, I was in graduate school at the time, when America was feeling a kind of loss of confidence, I think, in the early 80s, and Japan's economy was kind of booming and roaring ahead. And there was a lot of talk. There were books published at the time about, you know, Japan is going to be #1, and there was a lot of fear mongering actually in the U.S. and also fear that, you know, somehow we were going to be kind of dwarfed by or taken over by. And then, you know, this kind of thing sudden, you know, over the years and through negotiations and through different things that happened, subsided. And you know, it sort of feels like the issue of national confidence is one that plays into the current dynamic. And I just hope that, Americans can get confident enough to see that basically China is not a threat to our sort of status and our competitiveness and our idea of ourselves, and that we can, as Governor Holden says, both kind of find a place in the world that satisfies our idea of ourselves, find that sort of common ground and win-win place. We're not going to have common ground on all issues. There are a lot of areas that are very difficult where we disagree. And of course, there's espionage that goes back and forth both ways. We talk about it a lot more than the Chinese talk about it on their side, but there are these kind of reality-based factors that come into play. But I think there are a lot of very tough issues out there in the world. The evolution of AI, the evolution of technology, biotechnology, military hardware, climate change, obviously, food insecurity, pandemics, and it all is extremely worrisome and will require the working together by U.S. and China. Min, did you have a couple of thoughts?
Yeah. I would say that we were at the Carter Center event. It was so interesting because a lot of doom and gloom, pessimism in discussion until
this was the 45th anniversary conference in January at the Carter Center in Atlanta, right, on U.S. China relations.
Until the 3 mayors who went to China showed up. And so I encourage everyone to look at the Heartland Mayor Delegation to China. It's our YouTube channel. That gave us tremendous hope. And also our Agriculture Roundtable, 4th annual one, this year is going to China. There's a lot of interest. So again, sometimes if you're in that circle, whether it's heavily security or others, you might see the world as half empty. But in the circle we are in, we see a lot of glass half full. A lot of people want to go, interested in. So I think this is where we can nudge the future trajectory relationship to the positive relationship direction. So again, I encourage you to check out the Heartland Mayor Delegation to China, our report, Why China Matters Heartland, where we advocate finding a path between Pollyanna and paranoia. There is a path in between. And also check out our mayor, the Heartland Agriculture Delegation to China this June.
And remember that quote, the path between Pollyanna and paranoia. I think that's great. Ambassador Quinn, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you. I believe that most people running for president and politicians would say they don't have any problem with China, the Chinese people. Their problem is with the Chinese Communist Party. And often they specify that. And when I'm speaking in China and about our relationship, I often recall that in 1944, when both the US and China were in a war where our sovereignty was at risk and we were in danger of being conquered by a foreign power, that the US sent a military and State Department delegation to Yan'an province and had the very first ever connection with the Chinese Communist Party, and where we became partners, not adversaries, partners in keeping both of our countries from losing that sovereignty and independence. And the liaison between China and the US at that time was the father of the current president of China, Xi Jinping. It was his father who was the person who organized all of that. So we should remember that connection, historic connection 80 years ago, but still very important as we come to our decisions about how we'll deal with the Chinese Communist Party and with China.
Great. I think that's an excellent note to end on. I thank all of our panelists very much for being with us. And of course, also to our audience, sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I'm sure if you have further questions, you can email them to us or send them to our website, and we'll try to respond to you. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and please do stay with us, follow us, go to our YouTube channel, and follow the events in agriculture, in community connections and education connections, and other events that we're taking on at the USHCA.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.